The afternoon sun was warm, but Officer Dan Miller hardly felt it. He walked out of the quick-stop convenience store, tearing the wrapper off a protein bar with his teeth. It had been that kind of week. A long string of that kind of week, really. His job as a police officer in the small town of Clarksville felt less about keeping the peace and more about managing a never-ending list of minor annoyances. A barking dog here, a noisy neighbor there, a teenager's prank gone a bit too far. It was work that wore a person down slowly, like water dripping on a stone. He took a bite of the bar, his eyes scanning the quiet parking lot without really seeing anything. That's when he noticed a movement by the dumpster near the alley. A small, dirty ball of fur. It was a puppy, maybe a few months old. It looked like a mix of maybe 10 different breeds, with scruffy brown fur that was matted with mud and what looked like old grease. But its eyes were bright and clear, watching him intently. Dan sighed. Strays weren't uncommon, though they usually kept their distance. He finished his bite and crumpled the wrapper. "Go on, shoo," he said, his voice not unkind, just tired. He made a gentle waving motion with his hand. The puppy flinched, but didn't run. It just tilted its head, its ears perking up, shaking his head. Dan turned and started his slow walk down the sidewalk for his afternoon foot patrol. He liked these walks in theory, a chance to be out of the car, to see the town. But today, his boots felt heavy. He heard the faintest click-clack of small nails on the pavement behind him. He stopped and looked over his shoulder. The puppy had crept out from the alley and was standing about 20 feet back, frozen like a statue. Seriously? Dan muttered to himself. He clapped his hands once, sharply. "Go home! Scram!" The puppy jumped at the sound, ducking its head, but its paws didn't move. It just let out a tiny, high-pitched whimper. Fine, Dan thought. Let it follow. It'll get bored. He continued his patrol, checking the doors of the closed antique shop, peering down the next alley. Every time he glanced back, the puppy was there, a small, shadowy figure maintaining its exact distance. It was like having a silent, furry patrol car trailing him. The next day was Thursday, and the gray skies matched Dan's mood. He was dealing with Mrs. Henderson's third call this month about kids cutting across her lawn. As he finished taking her statement on her porch, he saw it again. The same scruffy puppy, sitting patiently at the edge of her perfectly manicured garden. It was cleaner today, as if it had found the puddle to wash in. Its eyes were locked on Dan. Mrs. Henderson noticed it too. "That darn dog has been hanging around for days," she said, frowning. "Doesn't bark. Just sits and watches." Dan thanked her and walked down the path. As he passed the puppy, it stood up and trotted after him, a little closer this time. Dan felt a flicker of something other than annoyance curiosity. This was persistent. He reached into his lunch bag, pulled out the other half of his ham sandwich, and tore off a small piece. He tossed it onto the grass between them. The puppy eyed the food, and Dan, then the food again. Hunger won. It darted forward, snatched the piece of meat and bread, and gulped it down in one bite. Then, instead of running away or begging for more, it sat back down and looked at Dan, waiting. It let out another soft whimper, this one sounding less like fear and more like a request. "You got your snack." "Beat it," Dan said, his voice softer now. He turned and walked towards his parked cruiser, keys in hand. The moment he did, the puppy erupted. It wasn't a bark, but a series of urgent, yelping sounds. Dan turned, startled. The puppy was running in a small, frantic circle. Then it dashed a few yards down the nearby alley. It stopped, looked back at Dan, and yelped again. This was new. This wasn't following. This was leading. With another sigh, heavier this time, Dan gave in. All right. Show me." He followed the puppy into the alley. The little dog trotted ahead, tail held low but wagging slightly. It led him past overflowing dumpsters and stacks of cardboard boxes to a dead-end brick wall. The puppy stopped, sniffed the ground, and looked up at Dan as if to say, "See?" Dan looked around. There was nothing. No injured person, no other animals, nothing out of the ordinary except some trash. "There's nothing here, buddy," Dan said, feeling a little foolish for talking to a dog. The puppy's ears drooped. It seemed confused, maybe even disappointed. It padded back to Dan, and in a move that surprised him, gently took the loose fabric of his uniform pants cuff in its mouth. It didn't chew or pull hard. It just held on, giving a small, deliberate tug down the alley, back the way they came, but pointing towards the old part of town dot as Dan looked down into the puppy's face. He saw no mischief, no simple hunger. He saw a deep, focused urgency. This dog wasn't just lost. It was trying to tell him something, and it had chosen him, the man in the uniform, to listen. The familiar, tired feeling in his chest began to thaw, replaced by a growing knot of concern. He had a sudden, clear thought that cut through his cynicism. This is part of the job, too. He nodded slowly at the puppy. "Okay," he said quietly. "Not now, but tomorrow I'm all yours. You show me." The puppy, as if it understood, finally let go of his pants. Friday morning felt different for Officer Dan Miller. The sky was a clear, bright blue, but it wasn't the weather that had changed his mood. It was the memory of a pair of serious brown eyes in a dirty puppy's face. All through his morning coffee and the brief at the station, he couldn't shake the feeling. That little dog wasn't asking for a handout. It was asking for help. And it had asked him. He finished up a report about a missing bicycle, the kind of small-town work that usually filled his days, and told the sergeant he was going to follow up on a possible stray dog nuisance call. It wasn't exactly a lie. He got into his cruiser and drove slowly towards the quick stop. His eyes scanned the sidewalks and alleys. Part of him wondered if the puppy would even be there. Maybe it had been a fluke, just a clever animal who had moved on. But as he pulled into the lot and stepped out, he saw it immediately. The puppy was sitting right where he had first seen it, near the dumpster. It stood up the moment Dan closed his car door. Its tail gave a single, hesitant wag. It was like it had been waiting for him. "Okay, partner," Dan said, surprising himself with the word. "You've got my attention. Show me what's so important." He decided to leave the cruiser. This felt like something he needed to do on foot. He walked over to the puppy, who didn't back away this time. Don knelt down, which took some effort in his stiff uniform. He held out a closed fist for the dog to sniff, a trick he remembered from a long-ago community safety visit to a school. The puppy sniffed his knuckles carefully, then gave them a small, quick lick. It was a gesture of trust. "Ready?" Dan said, standing back up. The puppy trotted a few steps ahead, then looked back. It wasn't running wildly like before. Its movements were purposeful. It led Dan away from the main street, down a side road lined with old houses with peeling paint. They walked for about 10 minutes, the puppy pausing at every corner to make sure Dan was still following. The town sounds faded, replaced by the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves. They reached the edge of the old town park. It wasn't much of a park anymore, more of a large, overgrown field with a rusty swing set. The puppy didn't go into the park. Instead, it turned onto a narrow dirt path that led into a patch of woods behind it. Dan hesitated for a second. He was a cop walking into an isolated area, following a stray dog. On paper, it was a terrible idea. But he looked at the puppy, who had stopped on the path, waiting patiently. There was no aggression in it, only a silent pleading. "Lead on," Dan said. The path was muddy from a recent rain, and Dan's boots sank a little with each step. The puppy moved easily ahead, its nose to the ground sometimes, then up, as if checking a scent it knew by heart. The woods were thick here, a tangle of oak and pine trees. They crossed over some old, rotting railroad tracks, the metal long gone, just the wooden ties left to sink into the earth. The puppy's pace picked up. It started moving faster, with more confidence. It was no longer a guide being careful with its follower. It was a creature going home. It ducked under a fallen branch and pushed through a thicket of thorny blackberry bushes. Dan had to push the branches aside carefully, the thorns catching on his uniform shirt. On the other side of the thicket, the trees opened up into a small, hidden clearing. It was a lonely, forgotten spot. And there, tucked against the base of a large, hollow-looking tree, was something that made Dan's breath catch. It was a shelter. Not a proper one, but something built from desperation. A torn blue tarp was stretched over some branches pushed into the ground. More branches and old cardboard were leaned against it to make walls. It was the kind of hideout kids might build for fun, but this one had a sad, serious look to it. The air here was still and quiet, and it smelled of wet leaves and something else, something stale and old. The puppy didn't run to the shelter. It walked to a spot a few feet in front of the tarp entrance and sat down. It looked from the shelter to Dan, and then it did something that sent a chill straight down Dan's spine. It lifted its head and let out a long, low howl. It wasn't a loud sound, but it was filled with a sadness that seemed too big for such a small animal. The howl echoed in the quiet clearing and then faded, leaving a heavy silence behind. Dan's heart was beating hard in his chest. All his police training kicked in. This wasn't just a dog leading him to its home. This was a dog showing him something was wrong. He unclipped the heavy flashlight from his belt. "Hello?" He called out, his voice loud in the quiet. "Is anyone in there?" "Police officer." "I'm here to help." Only the rustle of leaves answered him. He stepped closer, the puppy watching his every move. He used his flashlight to pull back the edge of the tarp, which was partly collapsed. The inside was dark and damp. He shone the light inside, sweeping it slowly across the space. What he saw wasn't a person, but the story of people. An empty plastic water bottle. A thin, dirty blanket spread on the ground. A few empty food cans, their lids peeled back sharply. His light beam traveled across the interior wall of the tarp, and then it stopped. Taped to the blue plastic, right at eye level for a child, was a photograph. It was a faded picture from a cheap printer. It showed a woman with a kind, tired smile, sitting on grass. And curled in her lap, clean and bright-eyed, was the puppy. This puppy. Its name wasn't just Puppy anymore. The woman in the picture was hugging it close. This was someone's loved one. This was someone's home. Dan felt a sickness in his stomach. This was a place where someone had been living, and recently. But where were they now? He looked back at the dog bear. He thought, the name suddenly feeling right. The dog was no longer looking at him. It had gotten up and was now sniffing the ground near the blanket, circling a particular spot. It began to paw at the soft earth, a focused, determined digging. The playful follower from the alley was gone. In its place was an animal on a mission, finally at the place it had been trying to get to for days. Dan knew, with a certainty that made his hands feel cold, that whatever bear was digging for was the reason for all of this. The following, the tugging, the howl. He knelt down beside the dog, his own fingers brushing away the loose soil. This was no longer a stray dog nuisance. This was the heart of his job, waiting for him in the dirt of this lonely clearing. The silence in the clearing was thick and heavy. The only sounds were the puppy's frantic scratching in the dirt and the rasp of Dan's own breathing. He watched the little dog for a moment, its whole body focused on that one spot near the edge of the blanket. This wasn't a dog burying a bone. This was a dog trying to uncover something. A cold feeling, deeper than the shade of the trees, settled over Dan. His policeman's mind, which had been dulled by routine, was now wide awake and racing. The photo, the empty cans, the makeshift shelter. And now this. Okay, buddy. Let me help, Dan said, his voice low and calm. He needed to be careful. This could be a crime scene. He put on a pair of thin gloves he kept in his pocket. He gently moved the puppy to the side. The dog whined but obeyed, its eyes fixed on the patch of earth. Dan used his hands, not his boots, to brush away the loose soil. The dirt was soft, recently disturbed. Just a few inches down, his fingers touched something that wasn't a root or a rock. It was smooth and cool, plastic. He cleared more dirt away, revealing a white, square container with a blue lid, the kind people used to store leftovers. It was sealed tight. He carefully lifted it out of its little hole. It was clean, not weathered, which meant it hadn't been buried long. The puppy immediately sat up straight. Its whining stopped. It watched the container, then looked at Dan's face, as if waiting for him to understand. Dan's heart was hammering against his ribs. He held the container in his gloved hands, sitting back on his heels in the dim light of the clearing. For a second, he just stared at it. This little box was the destination. This was what all the pulling and leading was about. The puppy had carried a secret it couldn't tell, and had brought him here to discover it. With a slow breath, he twisted the lid. It came off with a quiet pop. Inside, there was no money, no jewelry. There was only a single piece of paper, folded neatly into a small square. It was lined notebook paper, the kind from a school subject book. He unfolded it carefully. The writing was in pencil. The letters were uneven, sometimes big and looping, sometimes small and squeezed together. It was the handwriting of a child. A young child. Dan's eyes moved across the words, and as he read, the world around him, the trees, the shelter, the sound of the breeze all seemed to fade into a distant hum. The note said, asterisk, to who finds this? Asterisk, asterisk, my name is Jake. This is my dog, Bear. He is a good dog. He is my best friend. My mom is sick. She has been sleeping for a long time, and I can't wake her up. I tried. I am scared. I have to go find help for her. I don't want to leave Bear, but I have to. It is a long walk. Asterisk, asterisk, please. If you find him, take care of him. Give him water and food. He likes chicken. Don't let him be alone. He gets scared at night. Asterisk, asterisk, I will come back with help. I promise. Please help my mom. Jake. Asterisk down read the words once. Then he read them again, slower. The simple sentences landed in his gut like physical blows. Asterisk, my mom is sick. She has been sleeping for a long time. Asterisk. He knew what that meant. His eyes flicked to the dark opening of the tarp shelter. The mother was in there. She wasn't just sick. She was gone. And the boy, Jake. He had written this note, sealed it in a box, and buried it for his dog. Then he had set out, alone, to walk for help. How long ago? Dan looked at the note again. The pencil hadn't smudged much from the damp. Days? A week? A wave of nausea hit him, mixed with a fierce, aching sadness. This little boy, in the middle of his own worst nightmare, had thought first of his dog. Asterisk, don't let him be alone. He gets scared at night. Asterisk. The care in those words, the selflessness, was staggering. Bear, the puppy, nudged Dan's knee with his nose. He had been quiet, watching Dan's face. Dan looked down at the dog. This little creature hadn't been following him for food. He hadn't been looking for just any human. He had been looking for the right human. He had seen Dan's uniform, a symbol of help, and he had made it his mission to bring that help back to the only place he knew, back to this clearing, back to where his boy had left him with a terrible job to do. Guard this note. The dog had waited. He had tried to show other people, maybe, but they had shooed him away. So he tried again and again, until he found someone who finally listened. Dan felt a pressure build behind his eyes. He blinked hard, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. All the petty frustrations of his job, all the complaints about paperwork and long hours, melted away into nothing. This was why he wore the badge. For the Jakes, for the people who had no one else to turn to. He carefully placed the note back in the container. This was crucial evidence, but it was more than that. It was a sacred trust. He stood up, his knees cracking. He had to move. He had to act now. He pulled his police radio from his belt. His voice, when he spoke, was different. It was clear, urgent, and thick with emotion he couldn't fully hide. Dispatch. This is Unit 7. I am at the wooded area east of the old railroad tracks behind Maple Park. I need immediate backup and an ambulance. I have located a deceased adult female at a makeshift campsite. More importantly, I have reason to believe a juvenile male, approximately 7 to 9 years old, first name Jake, has left this location on foot within the last several days to seek help. He is alone. He has a small brown dog named Bear. I am with the dog now. We need to organize a search. Immediately. The child is out there somewhere. The radio crackled to life with confirmations. The dispatcher's voice suddenly all business. The quiet clearing was about to be very busy, but for one moment it was just Dan and the dog. Dan looked at Bear, who was sitting faithfully by the hole he had helped dig. This small, muddy animal was a hero. He was the only thread connecting a lost boy to hope. Dan knelt down again. He didn't care about the dirt. He put a steady hand on the puppy's head. "You did it, Bear," he whispered, his voice rough. "You did your job. You found me. Now I'm going to do mine. We're going to find your boy. I promise." He wasn't sure if promises made to a dog counted, but he meant it with every fiber of his being. As the first distant sound of sirens began to slice through the afternoon air, Dan Miller knew his week, his year, his whole idea of what his job was, had changed forever. It had all led to this clearing, to this note, to this dog. And now the real work began. The quiet of the clearing was shattered. First came the distant wail of sirens, growing louder until they cut off abruptly at the edge of the woods. Then came the voices, the crackle of more radios, the heavy crunch of boots on dry leaves. Dan stood near the shelter, holding Bear close against his chest. The puppy was trembling, overwhelmed by the sudden invasion of his lonely world. Other officers pushed through the blackberry thicket, their faces shifting from curiosity to grim focus as they saw the shelter and Dan's expression. The paramedics followed, carrying their heavy kits. For a few minutes, it was all business. Dan pointed, gave short, clear directions. He showed the senior officer, a man with graying hair named Captain Harris, the plastic container and the note. Dan watched the captain's face as he read it, saw the man's jaw tighten. "Okay, Dan," Captain Harris said, folding the note carefully back into its plastic evidence bag. "You did good getting us here. Now tell me about the boy." That's when Dan realized Bear was the key. He wasn't just evidence. He was a living, breathing clue. The dog, Captain. His name is Bear. The boy left to find help, but this dog. He didn't follow him. He stayed here. The boy told him to stay, in a way. He buried this note for him. This dog has been trying to bring someone back here for days. He found me. Captain Harris looked at the muddy puppy in Dan's arms, who was now hiding his face in the crook of Dan's elbow. "You think the dog can help us find the boy?" "I don't know," Dan admitted. "But the boy could be anywhere. He was on foot. He was scared. He might have stuck to the woods, or he might have tried for a road. But Bear, he's the last one who saw him. He's the only link we've got." The decision was made quickly. While the other officers and the coroner did their difficult work at the shelter, Dan's new assignment was the search for Jake, and his partner would be a small, scared dog. Dan carried Bear back to his patrol car, away from the flashing lights and the solemn activity. He opened the passenger door and set the puppy on the seat. Bear immediately tried to curl into a ball on the floor. "Not today, buddy," Dan said softly. "Today you're riding shotgun. We need you." He drove slowly back to the station, talking to the dog in a calm, steady voice the whole way. "It's okay. You're safe. We're going to find him, Bear. We're going to find Jake." The puppy seemed to listen, his shaking gradually subsiding. At the station, things moved fast. A missing child alert was issued with Jake's description. A boy about 8 years old, last seen wearing blue jeans and a red t-shirt, though that was just a guess from the note's tone. Maps were spread out. Search teams were being organized to sweep the woods and the old railway lines. But Dan had a different idea. He filled a bowl with water from the station's kitchen and found a can of chicken from his own lunch bag. He mixed the chicken with some plain oatmeal in another bowl and set them both on the floor of a quiet corner in the briefing room. Bear ate and drank as if he hadn't done either in a long time, every bite a desperate gulp. While the dog ate, Dan found an old, clean handkerchief. He needed something that might carry a scent. He didn't have anything of Jake's, but he had Bear. If the boy and the dog had been together constantly, their scents would be all over each other. He gently rubbed the cloth over Bear's back and head, trying to collect the dog's own scent, hoping it would smell like home and like his boy to another dog. He went to Captain Harris. "Sir, we need a tracking dog, but not to start at the shelter. The boy's been gone for days from there. The trail is cold, but Bear has been in town. He was at the quick stop in the alleys. What if Jake made it to town? What if he was close, but lost, and Bear was trying to bridge that gap? If we get a tracking dog to scent off this cloth off of Bear's own smell, maybe it can pick up Jake's trail from where Bear last was, from where he was trying to get our attention." It was a long shot. Captain Harris looked tired, but he nodded. "It's worth a try. We've called the county K9 unit. They're sending a handler and his dog. They'll be here in 20 minutes. The wait felt like forever." Dan sat on the floor next to Bear, who had finished eating and was now leaning heavily against Dan's leg, exhausted from the stress of the day. Dan absently stroked the dog's ears. His mind was a storm of images: the sad shelter, the pencil-scrawled note, the imagined face of a little boy walking alone down a dark road. Finally, the K9 officer arrived with his German shepherd, a serious-looking dog named Rex. Dan explained his theory and handed over the handkerchief. The handler, a no-nonsense man, let Rex sniff it thoroughly. "He's got a strong scent," the handler said. "Let's see what he makes of it." They started where it all began, for Dan, the quick-stop parking lot. The handler gave Rex the command. The big dog put his nose to the ground, circling the area where Bear had first been seen. He snuffled along the sidewalk, down the first alley Dan had been led into. He moved with purpose, but then he would stop, circle again, and look up, confused. The trail was a mess. Bear had been here for days, running in circles, following people, trying everything. It was like trying to find a single drop of water in a puddle that had been stirred up. Dan's heart sank. Maybe his idea was stupid. Maybe they were wasting precious time. Then Rex pulled his handler towards the old park. They followed. Bear, on a leash now held by Dan, trotted along, watching the big dog work. They entered the woods on the main path. Rex moved faster, his tail stiff. He was following the path Dan and Bear had taken that morning. He was leading them right back to the clearing. "He's just going back to the shelter site," Don said, frustration creeping into his voice. "We already know that trail." But just before the blackberry thicket, Rex stopped. He turned left off the main path, pushing into a denser part of the woods. This was a different direction. The handler looked at Dan. "He's got something. It's faint, but he's confident." They pushed through the undergrowth for about 100 yards. The trees began to thin, and ahead they could see the gleam of asphalt, a back road that led out of town towards the highway. Rex went straight to the edge of the tree line, right where the woods met the gravel shoulder of the road. He sat down and looked at his handler, a clear signal. This was where the scent ended. Dan stared at the empty road. A cold fear gripped him. If Jake had come this far and stepped out onto this road, he could have been picked up by anyone. Or he could have kept walking anywhere, but the canine officer was pointing at the ground near Rex's paws. "Look here." Dan stepped closer. There, almost hidden in the grass and dirt, was a single small footprint, the tread of a child's sneaker. And a few feet away, caught on a thorny bush, was a tiny shred of red fabric dot. It wasn't much, but it was proof. Jake had made it this far. He had been here, at the edge of everything he knew, looking at a road he hoped would lead to help. And from here, he had vanished. The search had a new starting point. But as Dan looked from the scrap of red cloth to the vast, unknown world beyond the road, the task felt more enormous and desperate than ever. He looked down at Bear, who was sniffing the spot where Rex sat, a low whine in his throat. The dog knew it too. This was where he had lost his boy. The scrap of red fabric was a tiny, heartbreaking flag. It told them two things. Jake had made it this far, and he was heading towards the road. The mood shifted from a search of the woods to something more urgent, more frightening. Captain Harris's voice crackled over the radio, redirecting teams to fan out along the highway, to check every side road, every ditch, every possible shelter a tired, scared child might have stumbled into. Dan stood by the roadside, the buzz of activity around him, feeling distant. He looked down at Bear, who was now sitting quietly by his feet, exhausted. The little dog had done everything he could. He had brought them to the secret place, and now, in his own way, he had helped point them in the direction his boy had gone. The rest was up to them. "Come on," Dan said softly, picking Bear up. "You're coming with me?" He didn't ask for permission. He just carried the puppy to his patrol car and settled him back on the passenger seat. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was personal. As he drove slowly along the back road, his eyes scanning the barren shoulders, the empty fields, a heavy thought settled on him. Night was coming. A little boy alone had already faced one night, maybe two. He couldn't face another dot. Dan drove and drove. He checked old barns, peered under bridges, stopped at lonely farmhouses to show Jake's description, now based on the note and the estimated age from the shelter. People were sympathetic, shocked, but no one had seen him. With every dead end, the knot in Dan's stomach tightened as the sun began to dip. Painting the sky in oranges and purples, Dan found himself back near the outskirts of town, not far from where the old railway tracks ran. He was fueling his cruiser at a small, run-down gas station when he saw the man. The man was tall and thin, wearing worn-out coveralls. He was paying for a cup of coffee and a few granola bars at the counter inside. The clerk, an older woman Dan knew slightly, was chatting with him. Seen you walking all up and down the tracks the last few days. You find what you were looking for?" The man shook his head, his voice tired. "Just checking on some of the old maintenance sheds. Company wants 'em boarded up. Tough to find 'em all, grown over as they are." Something clicked in Dan's mind. Asterisk railway tracks. Maintenance sheds. Asterisk, he finished pumping the gas and walked inside, his heart starting to beat a little faster. He approached the man, showing his badge. "Afternoon. Officer Dan Miller. I couldn't help but overhear. You've been checking the old sheds along the tracks?" The man nodded, wary. "Yes, sir. For work. How far out have you gone? Have you seen anything unusual? Anyone camping out, maybe? In particular, a young boy?" The man's eyes narrowed in thought. "A boy? Can't say I have. Most of those sheds are locked up tight or falling in. I did check one about 3 miles east of here, past the creek crossing. Door was jammed, not locked, but I figured it was just rusted shut. Didn't force it." He took a sip of his coffee. "Thought I heard something from inside a couple days ago, though. A real faint sound. Sounded like, well, I thought it was a hurt animal. A little whimper or something. I called out, knocked, but nothing. Figured it was just the wind or an animal in the walls." Dan's breath caught. Asterisk, a hurt animal. A whimper, asterisk. He thought of Bear's persistent whines. He thanked the man, rushed back to his car, and called in the location. But he didn't wait for backup. 3 miles. A jammed door. A sound. He drove as fast as he dared on the service road parallel to the tracks. Bear stood on the seat, bracing himself, sensing Dan's tension. When Dan judged they were about the right distance, he stopped the car, grabbed his heavy flashlight, and lifted Bear out. "Stay close," he said. They climbed the gravel embankment to the tracks. The fading light made the world look gray and washed out. Dan walked quickly, his beam cutting through the growing darkness, looking for the creek crossing. He found it a small, concrete bridge over a trickle of water. And just on the other side, half hidden by a wall of weeds, was a small wooden shed. It looked like a forgotten giant's toolbox, rotting and leaning. The door was metal, streaked with rust. Dan shone his light at it. It wasn't padlocked. He grabbed the handle and pulled. It groaned but didn't budge. It was jammed tight, just like the man said, "Jake!" Dan yelled, pounding on the door with the side of his fist. The sound was loud and flat in the quiet evening. "Jake, are you in there? It's the police. We're here to help." He pressed his ear to the cold metal. For a moment, nothing. Then he heard it. The faintest, thinnest sound. Not a whimper. A human voice. A tiny, cracked, hopeful sound. "Help?" Dan's eyes filled with tears instantly. He blinked them away. "I'm here, Jake. I'm right here. Stand back from the door." He put Bear down. He put his shoulder against the metal, digging his boots into the gravel. He pushed with everything he had. The door shrieked in protest, rust flaking off, but it didn't move. He stepped back, breathing hard. He looked around, saw a heavy, weathered piece of railroad tie nearby. He used it as a battering ram, hitting the door near the handle. Bang, bang, on the third hit. With a scream of tearing metal, the door jerked inwards a few inches. Dan dropped the timber, wedged his fingers in the gap, and pulled with all his strength. The door scraped open just enough for a person to slip through. Dan snatched up his flashlight and shone it inside. The beam fell on a small figure huddled in the far corner, on a pile of old, mildewed burlap sacks. It was a boy. His face was pale and smudged with dirt, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. He was shivering. He was wearing blue jeans and what was left of a red t-shirt, now torn and dirty. It was Jake Dot, and in that moment, Bear shot past Dan's legs like a furry bullet. He didn't bark. He didn't run in circles. He went straight to the boy, a journey of 100 miles in 3 seconds, and began licking his face, whimpering and wriggling with a joy that filled the entire dank shed. The boy's arms came up, weak and trembling, and wrapped around the dog. He buried his face in Bear's fur. His small shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. Then he looked up, his eyes finding Dan in the doorway, the flashlight beam catching the tears streaming clean tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. You found Bear," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse and crying. "You found him." Don knelt down in the doorway, his own vision blurred. He couldn't speak for a second. He just nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. "He found me, Jake," Dan finally said, his voice gentle and thick. "Your dog. Your brave, smart dog. He found me. And he wouldn't stop until I understood. He led me right to you." He reached out slowly, not to grab, but to offer. "Let's get you out of here, son. Let's get you both someplace warm and safe." The boy, still clinging to Bear, nodded. Dan helped him to his feet, supporting most of his weight. He wrapped his own jacket around the boy's thin shoulders. As they stepped out of the dark shed into the twilight, the first distant sirens of the responding units began to echo through the valley. Dan looked down at the boy, leaning against him, and the dog pressed close to the boy's legs. He felt a tiredness deeper than any he'd ever known, but beneath it was a warmth, a rightness that melted the last of the ice around his heart. The puppy had trailed a cop, and in doing so, had led them all back to what mattered most. In the glow of the flashing lights that soon surrounded them, Officer Dan Miller knew that some shadows, once you let them in, could lead you straight into the light.